The morning of April 20th, 1914, did not break with the softness of spring over the southern Colorado coalfields. It broke with the metallic taste of impending violence. In the canyon-scarred landscape of Las Animas County, the Ludlow tent colony sat exposed on the open prairie, a fragile city of white canvas housing 1,200 striking miners and their families. To the north and south, the imposing peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Range stood as silent, indifferent witnesses to the industrial siege that had gripped the region for 7 months. The colony was a defiant scar on the landscape of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, CF&I, a conglomerate owned remotely but absolutely by the most powerful family in American history, the Rockefellers. The air was deceptively still, but the silence was a lie. The previous day had been a cultural holiday for the colony's large Greek population, a rare day of rest where the sounds of traditional lyres had momentarily drowned out the grinding anxiety of the strike. But as the sun rose on Monday, the festivities were replaced by a cold, tactical reality. Major Patrick Hamrock, the commander of the Colorado National Guard detachment stationed at the nearby water tank, was mobilizing his men. These were not merely state troops. The lines between public order and private enforcement had blurred into non-existence. The Guard had been infiltrated and augmented by hard men from the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, mercenaries who had cut their teeth suppressing labor in the bloody hollers of West Virginia. They were armed with Springfield rifles, sidearms, and, most ominously, belt-fed machine guns positioned on the high ground of Water Tank Hill, looking down into the camp like iron vultures. At 8 a.m., the fragile peace began to fray. Major Hamrock dispatched a messenger to the tent colony demanding the presence of Louis Tikas, the leader of the Greek miners and a central figure in the camp's organization. Tikas, a man of immense physical courage and diplomatic skill, had spent the winter walking a razor's edge between the rage of his starving countrymen and the provocations of the militia. He sensed the shift in the atmosphere immediately. The militia was not posturing. They were deploying for battle. As Tikas met with Hamrock at the military camp, the conversation was a pretext. Hamrock accused the Union of holding a boy against his will, a charge Tikas denied. But while they spoke, Tikas observed the troops maneuvering with professional precision. A detachment was moving toward the strategic railway cut, a natural trench that offered a flanking position against the tents. Even more terrifying was the movement of the Death Special. This was an improvised armored car, a mechanical monster constructed at the CF&I plant in Pueblo. It was a touring car clad in boilerplate steel, impervious to small arms fire, and mounted with an M1895 Colt Browning machine gun. The miners called it the Death Special, not for its appearance, but for its promise. It prowled the perimeter of the camp like a wolf circling a sheep pen, its engine growling low in the morning air. Tikas broke away from the meeting and ran back toward the tents, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pulled a white handkerchief from his pocket, waving it frantically, signaling his people to take cover. "Down!" he screamed in Greek and English. "Get into the cellars!" The miners of Ludlow were not naive. They knew the topography of their own slaughter. Over the long winter, beneath the wooden floors of their canvas tents, they had dug cellars, pits intended for food storage and insulation against the brutal Colorado cold. Now, these root cellars were transformed into bunkers. Women grabbed infants still sleeping in their cribs. Fathers shoved children through trapdoors into the damp earth, covering them with mattresses and furniture. At 9 a.m., the signal came. It was not a whistle. It was a detonation. Boom. A dynamite bomb exploded in the air above the militia camp, shaking the canvas walls of the tents. Boom. A second explosion followed, echoing off the canyon walls. Boom. The third bomb shattered the morning calm. This was the coordinated signal for the militia to commence fire. Before the echo of the third blast died away, the machine guns on Water Tank Hill opened up. The sound was a rhythmic, mechanical tearing. The M1895 potato digger machine guns, so named for the operating lever that swung beneath the barrel, began to rake the tent colony. The rate of fire was hundreds of rounds per minute. The bullets didn't just strike the tents, they shredded them. The canvas offered no more resistance than paper. Household goods, stoves, cribs, tables, splintered under the impact, sending deadly shards of wood flying through the air. The siege had begun, the battle was joined, but the horror was just beginning. The miners, many of them veterans of the Balkan Wars, reacted with disciplined desperation. They grabbed their hunting rifles, Winchesters, Marlins, shotguns, and sprinted for the railroad cut. They knew that if they stayed in the tents, the colony would become a shooting gallery. They had to draw the fire away from the women and children hidden beneath the floorboards. A fierce firefight erupted across the prairie. The miners were outgunned, but they possessed the terrain of the railroad cut, which allowed them to pin down elements of the militia and buy time for their families. But the Death Special changed the geometry of the battle. The armored car roared onto the field, its machine gun traversing the lines of tents, suppressing the miners' fire and pouring lead into the colony itself. It was a weapon of industrial war brought to bear on domestic life. The bullets cut through the tent walls at knee height, specifically targeting anyone trying to crawl to safety. The steel plating of the car rang with the futile impacts of the miners' hunting rounds, invincible and terrifying. Inside the tents, the terror was absolute. The cellars, dug into the hard clay, were cramped and dark. In one pit, the Petrucci family huddled together. Mary Petrucci held her children close, the thunder of the machine guns vibrating through the ground into their bodies. In the tent next door, the Costa family was doing the same. The air in the pits began to grow stale, mixed with the dust shaken loose by the bombardment. Above them, the sunlight filtering through the canvas was punctured by hundreds of jagged holes, beams of light dancing in the dust like mocking spirits. For hours, the siege continued. The militia, frustrated by the miners' resistance in the railroad cut, began to advance on the colony itself. They were no longer trying to disperse a crowd, they were assaulting a fortified position. The rules of engagement, if they ever existed, had been abandoned. This was a war of annihilation against the Union. Lieutenant Karl Linderfelt, a man whose hatred for the strikers was legendary, moved his men closer to the perimeter of the colony. Linderfelt was a veteran of the Philippines and the Mexican border wars. He viewed the strikers not as citizens, but as insurgents. He had sworn to clean out the colony. And now, with the cover of the machine guns, he saw his chance. Sometime in the late afternoon, the nature of the attack shifted from ballistic to incendiary. Whether by a stray tracer bullet or, as many witnesses later testified, by the deliberate application of kerosene torches by militia troops, the tents began to burn. The fire started on the windward side. The canvas, dry and treated with waterproofing oil, ignited with terrifying speed. The wind acted as a bellows, driving a wall of orange flame through the rows of the colony. For those hiding in the cellars, the situation transformed from a siege to a nightmare. The sound of the gunfire was drowned out by the roar of the inferno. The heat was intense enough to blister paint on the iron stoves inside the tents, but the true killer was not the heat. It was the smoke. The fires consumed the oxygen above the pits. The burning floorboards collapsed, dumping embers and toxic smoke into the cramped bunkers below. Louis Ticas, who had spent the day running ammunition and checking on the wounded, saw the flames devouring his city. He knew exactly who was trapped beneath those burning floors. He knew of the maternity cellar, a special pit dug for pregnant women and nursing mothers. He knew of the children hiding with their toys. Desperation overrode his survival instinct. Ticas emerged from the railroad cut, waving a white flag running toward the militia lines. He was running into the teeth of the machine guns, screaming for a ceasefire. "Stop the fire!" he yelled, his voice cracking over the roar of the flames. "The women, the children." He was intercepted by militia soldiers. They did not stop firing. They dragged him toward the ruins of the pump station, where Lieutenant Linderfelt was coordinating the advance. Tikas stood before Linderfelt, the firelight illuminating the soot and sweat on his face. The Greek organizer was unarmed. He pleaded for the right to go back into the fire, to pull the families out of the pits. Linderfelt looked at him with cold contempt. In his hands he held a Springfield rifle. He did not see a humanitarian. He saw the face of the enemy that had defied the Rockefeller empire for 7 months. "You caused this," Linderfelt shouted. "You and your damn union." Tikas did not back down. "We are dying in there," he said. Linderfelt didn't shoot. Not yet. He reversed his rifle, gripping the barrel with both hands like a club. With a savage, guttural roar, he swung the heavy wooden stock down onto Louis Tikas' head. The force of the blow was so violent that the stock of the rifle shattered, splintering against the organizer's skull. Tikas fell to the ground, blood pouring from his head, dazed and semi-conscious. He was surrounded by the boots of the militia. The fire raged behind him, a curtain of death closing on the women and children suffocating in the dark. And there, amidst the smoke and the blood, we leave Louis Tikas on the ground, the fire roaring, the fate of the children unknown. To understand the fire that consumed the children of Ludlow, one must look back 60 years and 2,000 miles to the damp forests of upstate New York and the nascent industrial chaos of Ohio. The architect of the engine that drove the Death Special was not Carl Linderfelt, nor even Major Hamrock. It was a man sitting in a silent office in New York, a man who had been forged in a very different kind of fire. This U.S. businessman, John D. Rockefeller, was the world's first billionaire and was so hated he had to hire a private army. John D. Rockefeller was the son of William Avery Rockefeller, a man known to the whispered gossip of the countryside as Devil Bill. Devil Bill was a creature of the American frontier, a con artist, a bigamist, and a peddler of false hope. He was a tall, handsome sociopath who roamed the West, leaving a trail of seduced women and cheated farmers in his wake. He posed as Dr. William Livingston, a celebrated botanic physician. His primary trade was a cancer cure that he sold to the desperate for $25 a bottle, a sum that represented months of wages for his victims. The cure was a fraud, a vile concoction of crude petroleum and laxatives. The petroleum gave the mixture a strange medicinal taste, and the laxative ensured a physical reaction that convinced the gullible patient the medicine was working. William Rockefeller's life was a masterclass in predation. In 1849, he was indicted in Cayuga County, New York, for a serious crime involving a hired girl in the household, an assault that forced him to flee. To avoid prosecution, he moved his family, his long-suffering wife Eliza and his eldest son John, to Owego, and then later to Ohio, fleeing the law and his own reputation. He visited his family only sporadically, appearing like a storm front, pockets full of gold, flashing rolls of bills, and then vanishing again to his other secret families. But when he was home, he taught his son John the rules of his world. "I cheat my boys every chance I get," Devil Bill once bragged to a neighbor. "I want to make 'em sharp. I trade with the boys and skin 'em, and I just beat 'em every time I can. I want to make 'em sharp." Young John D. Rockefeller absorbed these lessons, but he filtered them through the prism of his mother's strict discipline. He despised his father's chaos, his gambling, his instability, but he respected the power of the money. He resolved to separate the accumulation of wealth from the chaos of the con man. He would not be a gambler. He would be the house. In 1855, at the age of 16, John found employment as an assistant bookkeeper at Hewitt and Tuttle in Cleveland. It was here that he discovered his true medium, the ledger. He purchased a small red notebook which he reverently titled Ledger A. In this book he recorded every single cent he earned, every cent he spent, and every cent he gave to charity. He treated the ledger with religious awe. It was a tool of total control, a way to impose order on a chaotic world. When the oil boom hit Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, it was a frenzy of mud and speculation. It was a devil bill world. Men made fortunes in a week and lost them in an hour. Rockefeller looked at the oil boom and saw inefficiency. He saw waste. He saw the idiocy of the many. He realized that the money was not in the drilling, which was gambling, but in the refining. The refinery was the choke point. If he could control the refining capacity, he could control the industry. He began to build his business with a focus on efficiency that bordered on the pathological. He obsessed over the cost of barrel bungs. He reduced the number of drops of solder used to seal a kerosene can from 40 to 39, found it leaked, and settled on exactly 40, saving the company a fraction of a cent per can that compounded into millions over the years. But efficiency was not enough. Rockefeller wanted domination. He viewed competition not as a virtue of capitalism, but as a sin, a wasteful friction that destroyed value. He believed he was destined to bring order to the industry, even if he had to crush every other operator to do it. The ledger was about to become a weapon of war. In 1872, John D. Rockefeller orchestrated a coup that would change the nature of American capitalism forever. It was called the South Improvement Company, SIC, and its mechanism was as brilliant as it was ruthless. Rockefeller knew that the lifeblood of the oil industry was transportation. The railroads, the Pennsylvania, the Erie, and the New York Central, were desperate for steady volume. Rockefeller went to them with a proposition. He would guarantee them massive, steady shipments of Standard Oil. In exchange, he demanded control over the rates. The deal was structured around rebates and drawbacks. The rebate was simple. When Standard Oil shipped a barrel of oil, the published rate might be $2.56, but the railroad would secretly refund Standard Oil $1.06. But the drawback was the anaconda's coils. When a competitor shipped a barrel of oil, they paid the full $2.56, but the railroad would take $1.06 of that competitor's money and pay it to Standard Oil. It was an economic death loop. Every time a rival tried to do business, they were subsidizing Rockefeller. The more they struggled, the richer he got. Armed with this weapon, Rockefeller launched what became known as the Cleveland Massacre. He approached the 26 independent refineries in Cleveland. He invited the owners to his office, showed them his books, and demonstrated that they could not possibly compete. "Sell to me," he told them, his voice quiet and reasonable. "Take Standard Oil stock. If you refuse, you will be crushed." 22 of the 26 sold out in less than 6 weeks. Those who resisted found themselves fighting a ghost. The story of the Widow Bacchus became a legend of the era, a symbol of Rockefeller's perceived heartlessness. Mrs. Bacchus, who had inherited a lubricating oil plant, claimed that Rockefeller bullied her into selling. She stated that her property was worth $200,000, but Rockefeller, knowing he had the power to cut off her supply of crude oil and her access to railroad cars, offered her only $79,000. When she appealed to his conscience, reminding him she was a mother of fatherless children, he reportedly promised to be fair, yet the price remained ruinously low. Rockefeller later vigorously denied this, claiming the plant was outdated, but the narrative stuck. The Titan would crush a widow for a decimal point on a balance sheet. Standard Oil didn't stop at rebates. They built an industrial espionage network that rivaled nation-states. Lewis Emery, a fiercely independent oil man, testified that the Standard had a Bureau of Information that bribed railroad clerks across the country. "I could not ship a barrel of oil," Emery stated, "without Standard Oil knowing it." If Emery sent a shipment to a grocer in a small town, a Standard Oil agent would arrive before the train. The agent would offer that same grocer oil at a predatory price, below cost, until Emery's shipment was rejected. The agent would operate through bogus companies, shell entities that looked independent but were actually Standard Oil fronts, designed to wage price wars without damaging the parent company's brand. By 1890, Rockefeller controlled 90% of the refined oil in the United States. He was the richest man in the world. But he was also the most hated. He was the octopus, the strangler of opportunity. He had to hire guards for his estate at Kykwit, installing electric alarms and iron gates, fearing not just thieves, but the rage of the public. He received constant death threats. He moved through the world in a bubble of security, isolated by his own immense power. The machine was perfect, but it was about to encounter a force it could not buy. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, CF&I, was the crown jewel of the Rockefeller industrial portfolio in the West. It controlled 70,000 acres of coal land and employed thousands of miners. But to the men who worked the seams, it was not an employer. It was a feudal lord. The miners lived in closed camps, towns owned entirely by the company. The company owned the houses, the schools, the churches, and the stores. The miners were paid in scrip, a currency valid only at the company store, where prices were often inflated. They were denied the right to assemble, the right to free speech, and, most importantly, the right to unionize. Safety was an afterthought. In 1912, the death rate in Colorado mines was double the national average. Over 100 men died that year alone, crushed by rock falls or suffocated by gas in mines where timbering and ventilation were sacrificed for profit margins. In September 1913, the United Mine Workers of America, UMWA, struck. Their demands were fundamental: recognition of the union, a 10% increase in tonnage rates, an 8-hour workday, the right to trade at any store, and enforcement of Colorado mining laws. The response from CF&I was immediate and brutal. They evicted the strikers. Thousands of families were thrown out of their company homes in the middle of a freezing autumn storm. They streamed out of the canyons, a caravan of the dispossessed, and settled on land leased by the Union at Ludlow. They built the tent colony, a grid of white canvas that became the symbol of their resistance. To break the strike, the company hired the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. These agents brought with them the death special and a tactic of psychological warfare. They shone high-powered searchlights into the tents at night, depriving the families of sleep. They fired random shots into the colony to keep the nerves of the miners frayed. In New York, John D. Rockefeller, Jr., who had taken over the management of these affairs from his father, was called to testify before a congressional committee. He sat in the hearing room, a polite, well-dressed man, utterly detached from the violence being perpetrated in his name. When asked if he would intervene to stop the bloodshed, he stood firm on principle. "My conscience will acquit me," he said. He framed the strike not as a struggle for safety or wages, but as a battle for the freedom of the American worker not to join a union. He pledged to support his managers to the end, essentially giving them a blank check to crush the strike by any means necessary. That blank check was cashed by men like Linderfelt and Hamrock. As the winter turned to spring, the stalemate hardened. The National Guard, initially deployed to keep the peace, had become an enforcement arm of the company, their wages often paid by CF&I when the state ran out of money. The stage was set. The rhetoric of principles in New York had translated into machine guns in Colorado. The check was signed, and the collection was due on the prairie. The sun had vanished behind the mountains, but the Ludlow prairie was lit by the ghastly illumination of the burning camp. The death special sat cooling in the darkness, its work done. We return now to Louis Ticas, lying on the ground, his head shattered by Linderfelt's rifle butt. He was barely conscious, surrounded by the militia. The fire he had tried to stop was now a roaring wall behind him. Linderfelt stood over him, breathing hard, the adrenaline of the massacre coursing through him. The militia did not arrest Ticas, they executed him. 3 shots rang out in the darkness. Louis Ticas was shot in the back. He died face down in the dirt, a martyr to a cause that Rockefeller had dismissed as a violation of freedom. His body lay unburied for days, a grim trophy of the company's victory. But the true horror was yet to be discovered. The next morning, after the fires had burned down to smoldering ash, The survivors crept back into the blackened ruins. They went to the Petrucci tent. They lifted the charred floorboards of the cellar. They found the death pit. 13 bodies lay in the hole, 2 women and 11 children. They were not burned. They were untouched by the flames. They had suffocated in the darkness, huddled together for comfort as the fire above sucked the oxygen from their tomb. The children were tangled in each other's arms. Mary Petrucci had survived, waking up next to the cold bodies of her 3 children, her mind shattered by the trauma. The news of the Ludlow Massacre did not just report the news. It ignited a revolution. The 10-day war began. Thousands of armed miners from across the state descended on the coalfields. They were no longer strikers, they were an army. They attacked mines, blew up company buildings, and killed guards. They seized control of the region. It took the intervention of President Woodrow Wilson and the U.S. Army to disarm the combatants. In New York, the shockwave was seismic. 26 Broadway was picketed by protesters carrying signs with images of the dead children. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was vilified in the press as a murderer. The principal of the open shop collapsed under the weight of the bodies in the death pit. Jr. realized that the old ways, the ways of Devil Bill, of the anaconda, of the paid spy and the hired gun, were dead. The public would no longer tolerate the arrogance of capital. He needed a new strategy. He hired Ivy Lee, a journalist who would become the father of modern public relations. Lee told Rockefeller the hard truth. Silence was suicide. They had to change the narrative. Lee advised Jr. to do the unthinkable. Go to Colorado. In a masterstroke of PR, John D. Rockefeller Jr. traveled to the coal camps. He didn't bring guards. He brought reporters. He met with the miners' wives. He ate beans in the mess halls. He listened to their grievances. It was theater, certainly, but it was effective theater. It signaled a shift from the era of industrial warfare to the era of industrial relations. And what of the old Titan? John D. Rockefeller Sr., the man who had built the empire, watched from his fortress at Kykwit. Under the guidance of Lee, he too began a transformation. The ruthless monopolist became the kindly old philanthropist. He began a new ritual. Wherever he went, he carried a bag of shiny new dimes. He would hand them out to children, to caddies, to strangers on the street. "Save it," he would say with a twinkle in his eye, "and it will grow." The cameras captured it all. The public, eager for a redemption story, began to soften. The dimes became a symbol of his benevolence, a deflection from the rebates and the spies and the burning tents. But in the high prairie of Ludlow, the wind still blows through the cellar pits. The monument there stands not to the dimes, but to the cost of the empire. It stands for the 11 children who died in the dark, the collateral damage of a war between the Ledger and the Union. The empire survived, but the ghosts of Ludlow would never truly be silenced.